Hello and welcome back to The Anecdotalist, Episode 9, The Abduction of Betty and Barney Hill, Part 2. I'm your host, Paul Packard, and with me as always, my co-host, Jason McKinney.
How's it going, everybody?
So far, we've covered Betty and Barney's story, their encounter, and then the chase with the craft. And then their subsequent abduction, uncovered in hypnosis sessions with Dr. Benjamin Simon. This is Part 2, and if you haven't heard Part 1 or aren't familiar with the Hill story, go back to Episode 8 and give it a listen. That said, today we'll be discussing what happened immediately after the encounter, Betty's conversation with the United States Air Force, the Hill's own personal investigation, Project Blue Book, and then, of course, common theories. Finally wrapping up with our own opinions. All that said, Jason, are you ready?
Yeah, man, this is like the most exciting part because we hear the big story and then we get to hear all the little stories that went with it, like all the extra little details. I'm actually really excited about this episode.
Yeah, I am too. I think it's going to be a fun one. It is interesting because now that we've done several two-part episodes, these ones are kind of funny because the first one is always this happened, this happened, this happened. And then part 2 is like, here's all the other ancillary stuff that happened, some theories. And then at the very end, we get to actually talk about how we feel about the whole thing. And going into this, I already have my own feelings as to what happened because I've been researching this for like the last 2 weeks. But this is a fun episode. Hopefully it'll be a little bit of some back and forth, not as like maybe linear as the other episodes, not as boom, 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 but we'll have some theories that we can walk through and just kind of speculate some. So with all that said, here we go. So, Jason, I hope that you had some time to let the Hill story marinate a little bit. So, coming into today, I was hoping that you would have some fresh questions, and then we can cover all our bases in part 2. It's always fun to work through the story and then come back together because usually when we're doing these and Jason's hearing the story for the first time, he only has so much time to think about what's going on. But by the time we get to part 2, you've been sitting on the story for at least a week at this point. Some of this has probably already gone through your mind. You're probably thinking, okay, I kind of think I know what happened.
And you know what's funny is I actually, the first day that we did this episode, next morning that I went to the gym, I like was writing down questions. Like I already have 3 questions right off the bat.
That's awesome. Well, hopefully we'll be able to get into those here shortly. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get into Betty's conversation with the U.S. Air Force. So if you remember in part 1, I mentioned the upstairs renters who, on seeing Betty and Barney investigating the radiation contamination on their car, they're like, you should call the Army. So Betty does. Betty calls the Army. If you recall, the incident occurred on the night of September 19th into the early morning hours of September 20th. So Betty calls the 100th Bomb Wing at Pease Air Force Base on the morning of the 21st, immediately preceding the previous day's events to report a UFO sighting.
It's kind of weird that the military is taking UFO sightings seriously.
I think they've been taking UFO sightings seriously for years and years and years. And we'll get into it here shortly because we are going to talk about Project Blue Book, which was the U.S. Air Force official UFO investigation arm. We'll get into that shortly. But yeah, they take these seriously. And then we're actually going to talk a little bit about the history of Project Blue Book. And I feel like the way they wrapped everything up, I think it just went dark and quiet. I think they're still investigating this stuff. It's just not as public as it was back then.
They're already talking to the aliens.
They're probably listening to us right now. So remember at this point, the only information the Hill should have is that first encounter. It was the following year that the abduction came out during the psychosis sessions. So at this point, the only thing that Barney and Betty Hill should remember is that cat and mouse chase through the mountains with the UFO. So they end up detailing out the night's events, including what the craft looked like. They exclude the part about the men looking down on them from the window of the craft. And later that day, Major Paul W. Henderson calls them and talks to Barney about his encounter. So Major Henderson then detailed the information to Project Blue Book, which again, we'll get into here shortly. Major Henderson fills out Form 112, which literally just goes point by point by point on all the details. It covers the description of the object, the description of the object's course, the manner in which it was observed, as well as a location and details. And so one thing I want to quickly note here is that there's an omitted section from this form, and I'm not really sure what's missing here, but what I can say is that that part of the document is gone.
That's just like some embarrassing misworded words. That's all.
Yeah, they said some things that they didn't like in hindsight, so they pulled them. Maybe, or it's something more serious, and we'll talk about that here shortly. So the parts of the document that were there, it goes into detail of pretty much everything we already talked about in part one. The object was about the size of a dinner plate held at arm's length. It also goes into detail that when it was first observed, it's about the size of a nickel held at arm's length. So I kind of like that. It's easy to think about, okay, what's a nickel look like at arm's length, about the size of the moon? What's a dinner plate at arm's length look like? It's easy to kind of wrap your head around what this object looked like in this brief document. So the series of lights along its side is mentioned in this document as well. And so one thing I don't think I said previously was that the object was shaped like a cigar in the sky. And of course, this is a common theme in regard to like disc-like structures that are often observed as UFOs. So a disc while flying looks like a cigar, roughly. Think about like a frisbee flying through the air. It's going to look like one little line, like a cigar in the air. But of course, when you flip it over, it's a circle.
Wow, that's so interesting. I actually never really thought about it that way.
You know what's funny is I didn't really either. And I know that UFOs are always kind of referred to as cigar-like shapes. And then as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about, oh yeah, like when you and I have gone and played frisbee golf, or when we used to pass frisbee in like high school and stuff. If you think about it, it looks like it's like a two-dimensional object, right? You're only seeing the profile. So it would look like a cigar flying through the sky, but in reality, it's a disc on its side.
Huh. That is so interesting.
So the document, again, just covers a brief retelling of the encounter. And so Major Henderson is intentional in noting that neither Betty nor Barney have any scientific or technical backgrounds, that the authenticity of the retelling can't really be judged at this point, but he is noted that by speaking with the couple, he felt that there was like an apparent honesty and seriousness made as they were walking through the description of the incident. And it felt valid just by how they were relating the information to him.
He's like, okay, yeah, maybe these people aren't completely crazy.
Yeah, maybe they are onto something. Well, think about that too. Like, if you think for a second, when someone's telling you something that's very clearly out there, but as they're telling it, sometimes you can tell in someone's tone and their body language and how they're speaking to you that, okay, they truly believe what's being said right now. And I think that comes through during this conversation, whether this is like crazy out there, this disc that was chasing them through the mountains. But if it's very authentic and if they're very serious about it, Major Henderson, he felt necessary to write down like, hey, these guys are pretty serious as we were talking through this. This wasn't a joke.
Yeah, it's just like the hypnotist said, everyone has their own individual truth. If they believe what they saw, it becomes their own truth.
It's their own objective reality. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's something else that comes up in this report that Major Henderson kind of felt necessary to include. There was another incident that occurred on September 19th between Major Gardner Reynolds and Captain Robert O. Doherty. That's a wild last name. I don't know if that's correct. I pronounced it as best as I could. So there's not information as to what this incident was or how it relates to the encounter, but Major Henderson includes that on page 1 of the Hill's Form 112.
I love how you keep saying this Form 112. Is this like a specific form for UFO abductions?
I think so. I think it literally is. They have a very official document, Form 112, that they fill out when they have an encounter with someone who's seen something otherworldly. Form 112, it's literally just like a description of all the items, which makes sense. It's like, think about this era. It's 1962. Think about what's going on. I mean, I think the Cuban Missile Crisis was in 1962, right? Wait, hold on. Hold, please.
I'm looking up this government Form 112.
Yep. October 19th, 1962. Oh, so that happens like a month after this. You think about how real that situation was. So the Cuban Missile Crisis happens about literally a month after this. And so this happened in September. Just all the stuff going on with the Soviet Union and how that the Cold War was ramping up. And then, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, probably the closest we've been to like an all-out nuclear war. We almost had ballistic missiles right next door to us in Cuba. And so they're very serious right now about UFOs. And we might think to ourselves, oh, it's silly. They have an official form to identify UFOs. But if you're thinking realistically, the Soviets, they're a real threat at this time. And so we're post World War II. There's a lot going on. There's new technology being created. Everyone's kind of on edge a little bit. So it makes sense that they have an official form to document UFOs, because we think of it as, oh, cool, aliens, extraterrestrial life. But maybe it's more they're documenting information, because what if there's a Soviet craft flying across the United States that got spotted by a person?
Yeah, see, that makes a lot of sense. And that would be my biggest fear.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's like a huge national security problem right there. You know, if they have this new aircraft that can literally float above someone's car without making a noise and do all of these patterns, I mean, that's a huge security thing. I mean, that's a scary, scary thought that they have this new technology if they did have technology that we didn't have yet.
Oh, 100%, especially at this time when we think about the United States now, and of course what's happened with Russia and Ukraine, and you identify Russia as being not at the capacity, not operating at the same capacity as what it would have been at this time, when both of them were considered superpowers that were kind of neck and neck. So yeah, they're racing to the moon at this point. So, you know, you go to the moon in 1969. And so there's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of technology being created. And it's a real threat. Any possibility of documenting UFOs and identifying enemy craft, I think that plays as much a role as anything else. So at this point, let's get into Project Blue Book. So in addition to Form 112, there's an official report sent to Project Blue Book. And first, I want to explain what Project Blue Book is and why it's important to this specific incident. So there's tons of resources on all this online, and we're going to include this in the show notes. Of course, we have the 2 books that we read for this, but also the other articles. And so for this specifically, if you want to go and read through what Project Blue Book was, it's been declassified, and all or probably not all the documents, because depending on whether or not you believe the U.S. government would actually give us everything, but pretty much all the documents supposedly of Project Blue Book are available. And so Project Blue Book was the U.S. government official program relating to the investigation of UFO sightings. The project ran from 1952 until 1969. And guess where the headquarters of Project Blue Book was, Jason?
I'm going to guess Area 51, Las Vegas.
No, Wright-Patt.
What?
Yeah, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
In Ohio?
Yeah, Wright-Patt.
You've got to be kidding me. That's kind of scary.
Yeah, so all that was happening there. At least, you know, that was 1969. We were here. We were born in 93. So I don't know.
That's true. That's way before us.
Have you seen, there's a movie, have you seen the movie Super 8?
No, I have not. It looks good, though.
That is, yeah, an alien movie about basically an alien that's being transported across the country on a train, and then it escapes, and these kids are shooting a film or whatever on a Super 8, and that alien, per the movie, is heading to Wright-Patt.
Oh, wow.
Wright-Patt is somewhat of a well-known alien, and I've heard stories. We've all heard stories. We've lived in this area for a long time. We hear stories of people seeing stuff or knowing stuff. Maybe I'm going to cut all this so that the government doesn't come knocking on my door. Hey, you were getting into some Wright-Patt stuff. What do you know? Nothing. Shut it down. Take my laptop. But no. So yeah, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So it was headquartered there. And so Project Blue Book was intended to basically analyze if there was a threat to national security, as well as just collect and assess UFO related data.
Oh, wow. That is so cool to like realize that we were like so close to a bank of information on UFOs.
Yeah, it's probably all still there. There were 2 programs before Blue Book. They did similar things, and most records include the documents from those other programs. So the U.S. government officially concluded Project Blue Book in 1969. And it's basically just stating that nothing they encountered possessed a threat to the U.S., and that nothing they encountered was categorized as extraterrestrial. They basically just said, hey, from all the data we've uncovered, We never really benefited. Nothing poses a threat, so we're done here. And I think it's an interesting way of taking a more public program and just kind of tightening things up. And my first thought is, guess what else happened with the US in 1969? They went to the moon.
That's not ironic.
So I'm like, does that play a role in why they wrapped up this? You encounter real aliens on the way to the moon, and they're like, hey, we got to make this thing more private because we're about to have an influx of stuff that we don't want the public to know about.
Yeah, they're like, oh yeah, we're gonna go to the moon, meet the aliens, and sign some peace treaties. By the way, they don't exist.
There's some crazy. We can go down a rabbit hole with the whole moon landing, and I mean, maybe that's an episode we cover at some point. But there's some like sit downs with like Neil Armstrong and different people that all the Apollo missions. There's some stuff that might come up from that you make you think, were they being watched? Were there aliens like just observing as humans made their first trek to another like terrestrial body? So we're gonna steer back to Project Blue Book, but maybe we can do a moon episode at some point here soon.
Oh yeah, that's definitely the next alien episode.
Yeah, I'm in for that. So Project Blue Book oversaw 12,618 sightings. 701 remained unidentified. So all records available today are supposedly available with names and places redacted. So a quick little history here. Some top generals were basically just dissatisfied with how the UFO research had been conducted up until the creation of Blue Book. And just overall, it didn't seem to be reaping any benefits, and it felt kind of like disjointed. So a guy by the name of General Charles P. Cabell, he led this charge. So Cabell was a four-star general who later was appointed to deputy director of the CIA. And he actually has some interesting ties to the JFK assassination. So again, we're going on all these tangents. I'm going to try to reel us in here a little bit, but we might do an episode on that eventually, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But Cabell's name comes up during the JFK assassination and the trial and all the information and everything that went into that, because he was deputy director of the CIA. And then, again, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but there's some interesting ties to the JFK assassination. So Cabell, along with some other high-ranking generals, they get Project Blue Book off the ground. And if you're curious about the name, it comes from the blue booklets that were used in testing at some universities. And so mostly because of how some high-ranking officials were just treating this program with such like intention and focus, they were giving it a lot of attention. And so they were thinking of, oh, okay, like the blue booklets you gave attention to at university when you were studying. So headquartered at Wright Pat, every Air Force base had Blue Book officers to take incoming UFO sightings. And a guy by the name of Captain Edward Ruppelt was head of Project Blue Book at Wright Pat until 1953. He died from a sudden heart attack in 1960 at the age of 37.
Age of 37. Just want to say that's pretty young to die of a heart attack.
I know. I wasn't really thinking about including that information, but I was like, the fact that this guy was the head of Project Blue Book and then died so young at 37 years old. I mean, of a heart attack.
Of a heart attack. I mean, it's not that common for somebody that's 37.
Yeah, he is in the military, so you would assume that he has, especially at this point, some type of health and fitness that he has to stay on top of. But yeah, 37 heart attack, which I thought was wild for the guy that was the head of Project Blue Book. So I mainly bring all this up because Captain Ruppelt, I guess, was there during Project Blue Book's prime and actually passed before the Betty and Barney Hill encounter. But Ruppelt had an extremely long leash, and he had authority to basically interview whoever he wanted. And he went outside the normal chain of command all the time to do so. So another huge name from Project Blue Book is a guy by the name of J. Allen Hynek. And if you are at all familiar with alien encounters from this time period, this guy's name will inevitably come up. He was a scientific consultant for the project, basically from beginning to end.
All I picture is that guy on the History Channel with the crazy hair.
Yeah, the ancient aliens guy.
Yep.
So back to the phone call between the Hills and the U.S. Air Force. So Major Henderson, he takes down the information from the Hills. And it seems like there are multiple phone calls that end up taking place here. And all the memos and documents, again, due to the Freedom of Information Act, they're available. One thing that's super interesting is that there was a document that was removed from the initial report that referred to the sighting as ground visual and air intercept radar. So just 2 seconds here. I don't know if this is the same thing that was redacted or withheld from Form 112, or if this is a different document that was withheld. Either way, this is a really interesting piece of information. So, air intercept radar would indicate some type of aircraft system, basically utilizing radar, and they had a read on the craft that followed Betty and Barney Hill. Let's kind of stop for a second and think about this. The initial report from Project Blue Book indicates, or I guess implies, that a U.S. aircraft using radar detected the craft. So Betty actually stated prior to this document being publicly available that someone had told her that jets were scrambled to intercept the UFO flying over New Hampshire. And so later this was removed from the report, which makes you wonder kind of why. I think it might be that they scrambled jets because they saw a craft. They do have it on ground radar at some point, but I think they detected a craft. They scrambled jets. They told Betty about it. And then once they realized what they were dealing with, they redacted it just in case it was something that was ultra sensitive. The fact that Betty knew about this and talked about it openly, and everyone's like, well, it's not in the information. And then the Freedom of Information Act pulls this document out. And right there, what Betty had said from the initial phone calls when they told her jets were scrambled to intercept the UFO. It is very interesting to me that this was initially included and then redacted or pulled. Either A, this was misspoken and this wasn't true, and they accidentally said, oh, it was air intercept radar, which would imply that a vehicle, a jet using radar identified a UFO, or B, they made a mistake and it was actually the ground radar that they meant to write. But it is interesting because that basically says that Betty and Barney, they see this phenomenon and the U.S. military already knew about it. So according to Kathleen Marden and Stanton T. Friedman in the book Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, there's speculation, or at least it's indicated, that there were other observers of this phenomenon. So as well as ground radar evidence of the craft, they go on to speculate that keeping all their witness and sources separate from each other, they were beginning to work on a cover-up story. So there were other people that had witnessed this. There's the air radar, the ground radar, and then supposedly other witnesses that were kept separate from the Hills. It kind of reminds me of the stories that came out of the Rendlesham Forest incident. So back in episode 3 and 4, when Burroughs, he runs into the group talking about the flying object, and somebody else is saying, oh yeah, did you hear the story of the other person that saw the craft that night? They also wrote a report. And they're both like, oh no, I didn't hear. And so like the government just kind of siloing out witnesses and sources so they don't interact with each other. I don't know if that's like a common theme or something they do whenever something like this happens, but this really reminds me of the Rendlesham Forest incident.
I mean, that's like the best way to prove that something's real, if you have like multiple people saying the same thing without being able to talk to each other,
Yeah, exactly. So keep the witnesses separate as to keep the story from spreading.
Makes sense. Military's really smart when they come to this stuff,
Yeah. Well, it's a very well-funded organization. So 17 miles outside of Lancaster, New Hampshire is North Concord, Vermont, where an Air Force station sits. This Air Force station indicated through previously mentioned ground radar that a large craft was spotted. And I assume these are the other witnesses mentioned, unless there were additional encounters in the area. But there was a college research study that indicated there was something spotted in this area that night. So they go on to say that Project Blue Book essentially ignored these reports and didn't pursue them further, which I think is wild. If you have a college research study that's happening in an Air Force station and they identify something in the air that night, and at the same time you have people saying we witnessed something else, so you have two different witnesses, and supposedly Project Blue Book just ignored this stuff, which makes you wonder, did they actually ignore it, or was this covered up in some way? So the last thing I want to talk about in relation to Project Blue Book is that they run through several things that it could be, such as like the planet Jupiter, maybe a natural weather phenomenon, like from the valley. But in the end, they conclude, quote, insufficient evidence. So Marden argues that since Project Blue Book ignored the parts of the Hills encounter that didn't fit the conventional aspects of like known phenomena, they reached the conclusion of insufficient evidence. I mean, I don't really think if they included the phenomena, like if it would bring in any different conclusions. Marden seems to feel that way, at least in the book. So either A, there truly was insufficient information to come to a conclusion, or B, this thing was covered up.
I would go with B. I'm thinking like the government always knows more than what they're giving off.
I would agree with that. So far we've talked mainly about the US government's involvement and investigations. So now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Hill's own personal investigation, as well as some key like non-military investigations that took place. So first let's talk about the nonprofit organization, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, or NICAP for short. The director of this organization was Major Donald Kehoe, who he sends out a man named Walter Webb to investigate further. And so Webb is an NICAP chairman and investigator. So intrigued by this, Barney reads like Kehoe's book, which Jason, remember that because it comes up later. This is important. It comes up in the theory section. So Barney is kind of enthralled with Kehoe and NICAP and the book that Kehoe wrote. So Webb comes out and investigates. He writes a report on the matter and it's published. So now we don't really need to go through this whole report, as it's pretty much everything we've already covered and know about the encounter. But it's important to note because this is kind of the first public information about this encounter, and dust kind of starts getting kicked up around the Hills encounter. So two guys from IBM, one guy, Robert Hammond, and another guy, C.D. Jackson, they hear about this and they come out. They first sit down with Major Kehoe and they write a letter to the Hills. And I guess Barney mistook them in for investigators affiliated with the NICAP, but they were these IBM guys. But Barney goes ahead and tells them everything. So this interview with these two IBM guys is important because they were approaching this encounter extremely analytically. And like, what time did this occur? Where did this occur? How long between point A and point B, etc. And what this did was kind of nail down, well, hey, wait a minute. Our timeline doesn't really make sense. So before this, they were aware that they had encountered the craft and they kind of felt groggy immediately after the encounter. They were aware of the fact that time didn't really line up. After sitting down with the guys from IBM, they realized, hey, we're missing 2 hours from that night.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. So this is kind of leading up to the hypnosis sessions. So knowing that, and then also speaking with Major Kehoe and reading his book on UFO encounters, they start thinking maybe there's more here than just that initial cat and mouse chase with the UFO. So before we move on from here, I want to talk about nitrates. And I don't know the significance of this, but it's mentioned and alluded to. And I had to go and find an article that relates nitrates to UFO encounters. So these two IBM guys, they're asking Betty and Barney all these questions. And they asked them, hey, did you have nitrates with you in the car? And Betty's thinking like, well, that's a dumb question. Why would you ask that? But then she realizes, wait, I had a bag of fertilizer in the trunk of the car. So she was planting stuff in her garden, had this fertilizer. And I think if you remember from part one, they all leave in like a hurry to go on their trip to Canada. So they just kind of shove the bag to the side. And so the bag is in the car during the trip. So they do have nitrates with them. And the book doesn't really go into detail other than the fact that they asked that question. So I kind of thought, oh, what's the point of this? Why ask that? So I went and found some sources on that, and it's in the show notes. You can read about it. But I found this UFO Experiences blog that specifically hones in on nitrates and their significance when it comes to UFO encounters. So basically, there's this connection between nitrates and UFO encounters that oftentimes this plays some significance. I guess a high number of encounters happen on farms and with livestock. There's also like animal mutilation, of course, those cases, which reference certain like organic materials along with components of fertilizer and manure that are high in nitrates. I don't think we need to go like speculating here, but like just go and read this source. It is really interesting that the IBM guy thought to ask it. Two, Betty's like, wait, I did have nitrates in the car. And three, for some reason, this plays a role in UFO encounters.
It's probably their gasoline.
Yeah, maybe it's something they specifically need. That's why they mutilate cows to get their nitrates out. Okay, so one last thing before we get into the Hill's own personal investigation. So they had this interesting encounter with first Project Blue Book, then the NICAP, and then these IBM guys. So the gears in their head are really starting to move, and they're thinking, okay, something more happened here. They go out to the abduction location with the IBM guys, and they kind of do some field research. So this is really interesting. They get back home, and they realize someone's been in their house. On the center of the kitchen table is a pile of leaves. In the middle of the pile of leaves are Betty's earrings that she was wearing the night of the encounter.
How interesting. Did she didn't like lose them? Did she say anything about her losing them that night?
So up until this point, she didn't really even think about them. They weren't even part of her memory. She forgot about them. But when she sees them, so again, a pile of leaves on the table with earrings in the middle, she then is like, oh yeah, those are the earrings I was wearing. I didn't remember that. And she's now realizing that she didn't have possession of them after that night. They're on her table, her kitchen table, and someone's basically broken into the house. I think this shows that maybe she dropped her earrings during this encounter, and they're like, oh, shoot, let's get her earrings back to her. And however they beamed the earrings to the table or whatever, they picked them up, and some leaves got picked up with them, and they got placed on our table, and they bounced.
Man, we got some nice aliens.
Yeah. Well, you remember from part 1 how nice that encounter seemed to be.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay, so now they're in this, like, what the heck is going on phase. So in part 1, we discussed the psychosis sessions with Dr. Benjamin Simon. So at this point, that hasn't happened yet. They've had this encounter. They're realizing there's more to this. So they decide they're going to start doing their own investigation. The Hills are interacting with the IBM guys, the Air Force officers from Pease Air Force Base. They're still working with Webb from NICAP, and they're starting to hypothesize on the encounter, and more specifically, the beeping that happened during the encounter. So they get kind of like in the weeds a little bit on how radio communication with extraterrestrials may occur, and somehow this plays into like the beeps they were hearing with the vehicle at the back, like in the trunk. They start exploring hypnosis as a mean to draw like more information. So they end up talking to this guy, Captain Ben Sweat. So this guy Ben is a hypnotist, and they discuss the possibility of hypnotizing Betty. And so Betty is having these like recurring disturbing dreams at this point. And in part 1, we talked about PTSD presenting as like a physical malady. So it's hypothesized that her nightmares are a presentation of this amnesia related to the missing 2 hours. So Ben basically says, hey, it's probably too dangerous to pursue hypnosis at this time. And he doesn't want to do hypnosis with them because he feels like at this point, something is crazy going on here. She's having these nightmares. There's some really serious PTSD here. And he kind of pulls back and he doesn't want to do the hypnosis.
Which, I mean, is a smart move. If you feel like you're already compromised in the brain, it's kind of scary to compromise yourself even more,
Yeah, you don't want to pursue anything that's going to add problems. But the thing is that now this hypnosis is kind of planted in Betty and Barney's mind. Like, maybe we should be pursuing this. So Betty's dreams are like getting worse and worse. And Barney is starting to really struggle with severe anxiety. So they mentioned the anxiety of like driving long distances or in like open areas. Obviously, if he's been chased by a UFO, he's going to be anxious in that space. But if you remember from part 1, Barney works in Boston and he's commuting still an hour and a half both ways. So his anxiety starts to really cause physical problems. He's having like stomach issues and just all around. He's just not healthy at this point.
Yeah, hour-long car ride and having to go to the bathroom every few minutes is not fun. How long did you say his car ride was?
An hour and a half.
Oof.
Yeah. So they're meeting with a psychiatrist and still meeting with UFO experts, and they're giving talks. And it's at this point they're referred to Dr. Simon for the hypnosis, which basically uncovers the abduction we discussed in part 1. So they do go through with hypnosis, and it pulls out the whole abduction piece. So if you're listening to part 2 right now and you didn't listen to part 1, go back and listen to it because there's a whole section on first the encounter and second the hypnosis sessions that pull out the actual abduction. So if you're thinking, okay, well, what's the point of everything we just covered? Why point out all these interactions? It's important because this leads us into our first theory. Betty and Barney Hill were highly sensitive to the influence of these experts. So our first theory is that the Hills experienced something, whether that was a natural phenomenon or Jupiter or whatever. They then, from this influence of these other actors, accidentally weave this story that goes well beyond what actually happened. And Dr. Simon pulled that out in his sessions with the Hills. So you have to remember that immediately after the encounter, Betty called her sister and was immediately led to find radioactive contamination. They spoke with the government, who during phone calls may have leaked data about unidentified flying object. Barney was enthralled with Kehoe and the NICAP's findings. Remember, we talked about that earlier. He was like really getting into the Kehoe's book. And so the suggestion is that through all this information and sitting with like the IBM guys, these things led to the Hills believing that something occurred and that something was an alien encounter. This is well before Dr. Simon even hypnotizes them, that they're feeling like maybe they were abducted by aliens.
This has got to be pretty obvious. They've got 2 hours of missing time. It's kind of one of those things where you see all this stuff in the past. You hear from everybody else, like what's going on. 2 and 2 fits together. Everybody else has been abducted by aliens. They're missing time. They have all these things happen to them where they're losing memory. It's definitely seems like 2 and 2 equals 4.
Yeah, I think that again, that's the first theory. So the theory is that something happened to them. They got really in the weeds with all these other things, and they kind of wove this story unintentionally and started believing, hey, the IBM guys felt we were missing 2 hours. Hey, Kehoe's book, that information talks about what happens in missing time is abductions. And so they get down this rabbit hole and they weave this story kind of in their brain. And then it causes additional anxiety with Barney. And then Betty is causing these nightmares to occur. And this story is just kind of developing for them. And so by the time Dr. Simon gets to them and begins hypnosis, he's pulling out this story that they've unintentionally weaved. Just to quote Dr. Simon, the same quote from earlier, quote, "Hypnosis is not a pathway to object truth. Rather, it is the truth as the subject perceives it, and it may or may not be consistent with objective reality," end quote. And so their objective reality is this story that's essentially developed since the encounter. Kind of along the same train of thought about influence, I want to focus on Betty's dream. So this is kind of our second theory here. It's well documented that through this period, Betty is having these like wild dreams, these nightmares. And even Dr. Simon, during his sessions, he worries about this regularly. I mean, Betty's dreams align too closely to the hypnosis sessions. And there is a real concern that her dreams are A, being recalled in these sessions, or B, influencing Barney as well. So now the argument could be made that she's just having these dreams in response to the traumatic event of the encounter. But like wider criticism is that these dreams came first and are kind of where all this abduction information comes from. So in part one, we discussed, the leader telling Betty she may remember or recall more things differently than Barney. And we had hypothesized that, the anatomy of women and men may play some sort of role in memory recall. Obviously, there's no way of like really knowing that. There's, of course, no way of knowing how alien technology would impact people differently, except for the fact that during Betty's session, she recalls the leader indicated to Betty that they will have different memories.
I think both of our wives would probably say that they have better memories than us as well.
Yeah, that's a whole different story. It is important to note that like many people who experience traumatic experiences and they face amnesia, like in relation to the traumatic event, they often recall those events through like nightmares. So we're kind of stuck between what came first. Did these nightmares happen first and cause the implanted memories? Or did this traumatic event take place and cause the nightmares to present later on? So both hold enough weight that they could either be true. I mean, there's no way of really knowing. The other thought I had, which kind of ties into Dr. Simon's quote about objective reality, maybe there was a traumatic experience which caused these nightmares to occur, and Betty's objective reality is this abduction nightmare. And so it's like her brain's way of protecting her from what really happened. And so then Barney's anxiety and stress kind of latches onto those dreams and they weave this alien abduction story.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like a different kind of psychosis for that military guy that lost his eyesight due to his buddy dying in World War II. It's just a different kind of psychosis. You know, something traumatic happens to you, and your brain has like those defense mechanisms that kick into gear.
Yeah, the brain is very unknown. We don't know. I mean, as humanity, we know a decent amount of a lot of medical things, but when it comes to the brain, there's a lot of unknowns still. And we know that when traumatic events happen, our brain protects us from those things. So who knows what happened? So maybe it was a UFO encounter. They erased her memory. They erased Barney's memory, and it's starting to reappear as these like nightmares.
Yeah, man. I will say that working in the medical field, I hate having like neuro patients because the brain is really like one of the most complicated things to mess with. You know, the heart, you know, you got electrical activity, you got mechanical activity, and once you like get it figured out, it's easy to go. But the brain, man, it's just so many what ifs, and we don't really know why. If you put pressure here, it does this or that. Oh my gosh, it's so complex.
It's extremely complicated. Yeah. Okay, so the last area I want to cover is that there was some type of phenomenon that occurred during Betty and Barney Hill's drive. But once this all started gaining notoriety, the story grew. Betty, from this moment on, is an outspoken UFO hunter. I mean, many people seek advice from her in regard to UFOs, and she kind of slides a little bit. So she kind of sees UFOs everywhere at this point. There was a story I read where she was talking about where she just kind of went outside and was just pointing at different lights in the sky, like different stars, and saying, "Oh, that's a UFO, and that's a UFO." So she basically embraces like this non-objective, non-scientific side, and it burns out her credibility a little bit. And I mean, I understand kind of both sides of this. If she truly had an encounter, of course, she's going to be incredibly enthusiastic and passionate about these things. You know, when it comes to aliens, extraterrestrial life, unidentified crafts, etc., she is going to be enthusiastic about it because she had her own encounter. However, the other side of this is that as things kind of died down, and so Barney dies not too long after this, and so the story kind of begins to fade. You start losing notoriety. You could see where like critics might say, "Well, she's slipping from the limelight, and now she's spinning these tales to get back into it," and that brings like the previously credible story into suspicion because if she's willing to go outside and just point into the sky at like normal lights, stars, whatever, and say that's a UFO, that's a UFO, that's a UFO, then who's to say that first encounter wasn't a tail as well? Personally, I think I kind of get it. You imagine if there truly was a traumatic event and it's all front and center and then it starts to fade a little bit, you're going to be enthusiastic about anything. But critics point to this as she kind of lacks credibility based on things that happened later on in life.
Man, that's really sad, especially if this really was something that she, encountered.
Yeah, I know. It's like if you really encounter something crazy as in your when you were younger, maybe even unintentionally, you would be more sensitive to things and think things are happening when they're really not. But people that are looking for every little way to criticize that, they're going to say, "Okay, well that ends your credibility. That shreds your credibility." And you do got to kind of feel for Betty here. I mean, she lost her husband when he was younger, right after all this happened, right after all this notoriety. And I don't know. I don't think what happened later in life should compromise the objective information we have from this first encounter. But that is the next theory is that she doesn't really have credibility. She's willing to she kind of, like there's this little bit of all right, she's crazy. She's seeing UFOs everywhere. Just forget about this whole thing, which I don't think is fair.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely not fair because back in back when it first happened, you had the military involved, you had reporters involved, you had a hypnotist involved. I mean, her husband was involved. You didn't just have her as a reliable source, but you had multiple other sources that were getting in on this.
Yeah, yeah.
She has some credibility. She probably lost it as she grew older, but she had some credibility at one point in time.
Yeah, and the whole thing with Betty's like enthusiasm. I mean, the book "The Interrupted Journey" by John G. Fuller. That was the early criticism of that book. Was it really focused on Betty and how intense her interaction. Remember when we talked about her UFO abduction experience and how different it was from Barney's, and Barney's didn't have as much material as hers did. And she has this whole interview with the leader and all this stuff happens. That's always been a criticism. So as Betty gets older and things get kind of wilder and wilder, it then you go back and say, okay, well, Barney had all these smaller things happen. He says all these less detailed things. And so maybe from the very beginning, this has been a problem. I mean, the first book, The Interrupted Journey, the first criticism was, well, why is Betty's experience so different than Barney's?
Yeah. I definitely have like a lot of agreement in the fact that men and women, share different experiences and they remember different things.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So I mean, I can totally like see that, whether the aliens, abducted her and all of a sudden because of their brain memory wiping ability, they can only wipe so much for the men. I don't know about that, but
Yeah.
for the most part, I know that men and women obviously remember things very, very differently.
Yeah, in her session, if you remember from part one, the leader tells her, like, hey, you're gonna remember this differently than Barney. And anything you say about this event is gonna confuse Barney. Which makes you think if she's weaving this story, then of course that's going to make sense to say that. But or on the other side of that, that would explain all the discrepancy, or that would explain all the enthusiasm from Betty and the more minute details from Barney. Okay, so now at this point, let's get into our own personal opinions of what happened to Betty and Barney Hill.
But I have questions. I had three questions that never really got answered.
Okay, let's yeah, pull some questions out.
So my first question that I actually really thought of almost the day after, is it common in this area for where Betty and Barney saw this UFO?
So interesting you asked that because if you remember from part one, John G. Fuller, who wrote the book The Interrupted Journey, he was there investigating UFO sightings in Exeter, New Hampshire, like not that far away. So I don't know if I'd say if it's common from this area, but there was something happening right before this with Exeter, New Hampshire, like right down the street, basically, of some UFO sightings. So there was already being at this point there was investigations happening about UFOs right around the time or right before Betty and Barney had their experience.
And I guess that would kind of lead me to my next question. Was there a military base close to this area?
I think the closest was yeah, so like 17 miles outside of Lancaster, New Hampshire. There was that Air Force station that is right next. It's basically North Concord, Vermont. So it's right down, only 17 miles away from Lancaster, New Hampshire. So basically, right nearby, there was stuff, and I think Pease Air Force Base is also really close by as well.
Okay, so my thought is there's always possibility of U.S. government testing some stuff out, just taking their own people and probing them.
I mean, it's 1962. There's it's more than likely there's all kinds of like top secret aircraft and things flying around the U.S. So if you're close to an Air Force base, yeah, probably was there probably was some highly classified aircraft cruising around at this time.
So key point here is don't live close to a U.S. Air Force airbase, or else you will get probed.
I'm the one. I'm what 31 years old. I've lived next to one for 31 years. I haven't been probed yet, so we'll see what happens.
That you know of.
Yeah, that I remember. Maybe I need to be like go through some like psychosis sessions and see if something's happened at Right Pat.
Okay, my other question is did Betty or Barney have any mental health issues that you know of?
That's a good question. I actually don't know, but they were seeing a psychiatrist because of Barney's anxiety. He was like really pursuing psych. So maybe there was something because he was so anxious and had these problems. But I never really saw if it was before all this, if he was already seeing a psychiatrist, or if all this that happened had caused him to pursue a psychiatrist. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
Anxiety wouldn't cause delusions, though, I wouldn't think. I've never heard of anxiety causing delusions.
Yeah, but anxiety can cause like you to be more on edge, or to like if something happens, you could
Over exaggerate it.
over exaggerate things. Yeah.
That makes sense, but it's kind of hard to over exaggerate getting probed the way he did. And
Yeah, true.
I don't know. That's a lot of that's some really heavy over exaggeration.
Yeah.
So I guess my last question is that you said the radiation on the car. Did the government like experiment on that at all?
Not that I read. The only thing that I saw about that was the fact that when Betty called her sister, and her sister was talking to the physicist, and he's like, "Hey, grab a compass and see if it spins when you get it close." That's the only thing I saw. I don't know, because like the physicist J. Allen Hynek, you would assume he was involved. I don't think so. I don't think I read anywhere that was the case. Even when the IBM guys asked about the nitrates, I don't know if they ever really looked at the vehicle, or if they ever like even studied or took samples. I think it was just they had that interaction with Betty's sister, who said the physicist told her to get a compass out, and I think that's really it. I don't think that anything happened with the car beyond that.
Interesting. So interesting. Wow.
Yeah, which makes you feel like, I mean, Form 112 didn't get into like, hey, get some samples. But, like even the Rendlesham Forest incident, when they were collecting all those samples, those radioactive samples, you would think that they would at least investigate the car. I don't know.
That car is in Area 51 currently.
Probably is. It's probably right, Pat.
Great.
I was going to say that actually that car made a cameo in Harry Potter, if you remember. And it was crushed by the Weeping Willow.
It's flying around. And, I feel bad. I bet you anything that the listeners probably have better questions than I can ask. But if anybody does have a better question during this podcast, please definitely reach out to Paul, because Paul's the one that will answer the question, not me. But
yeah, go to our website. You can ask us questions. They go straight to our email box. When that little box pops up in the window on the screen, and it says "Have any questions?" If you put something in there, it'll go straight to our email box. So definitely do that. Okay, so let's talk about like our own personal opinions on what happened to Betty and Barney Hill. So personally, I feel like there was an initial encounter. Something happened on the road as they were traveling home. I think that I don't know if I would say, I don't know if I'd go as far as say, oh, it was definitely an alien, but there was an encounter. Whether it was some type of craft that was a military, top secret military craft or whatever, or a natural phenomenon. Betty and Barney Hill, they saw something that night, and it freaked them out. It mess with them to some extent. So for me, I personally feel like something happened there. Beyond that, I have a really hard time just knowing all the things that I read and that I know, that the hypnosis sessions and all of that, just for me, I think that just goes too far. I just don't think that holds enough validity that they really were abducted and probed and all that stuff happened. I think that something definitely happened on that trip home, but beyond that, I don't know if I can say that they actually encountered and interacted with and talked with aliens. That just feels like it's too far for me. But I do feel like something happened on that drive home, whether it was a natural phenomenon, a military top secret craft flying around, or maybe it was an alien aircraft, a UFO. But for me, I feel like something definitely happened that night. But after that, I don't really go past that.
so honestly, I have to go the opposite side of the coin. I don't know. There's only two witnesses here. So I know you said that the military went and intercepted a ship on the radar. Like they had told Betty that they went to intercept a ship when they noticed it on the ground radar. So I know that they said that, but I just don't know. There's only two eyewitnesses here, and it's in the middle of the night. They just got back, on vacation. Yeah, like it's just kind of hard to believe that they got abducted, probed, and sent on their merry way. I don't know, man. Like this one, I like the Rendlesham Forest one because you had the military, you had a bunch of guys out in the woods witnessing the same thing, multiple guys. This is just feels a little different because it's a couple that are kind of witnessing the same thing that was kind of popular to witness during this time period.
I know exactly what you mean, and that's why I felt like the second part of the story I don't feel as sensitive to, but I still think something happened that night. But I can see what you're saying. Like, it is popular to feel this way. They to see a UFO, and Betty, I mean, her sister had seen a UFO, and she was so excited to tell her sister, "Oh, I also saw a UFO." So I could see what you're saying. Like, this could, and they're the only people there, and Betty has this wild imagination, and maybe it was just this overly woven story, and then it caught the military's attention, then it caught NICAP's attention, and then it just like became this massive thing, and they just ran with it. I get that opinion. And I could see that. I just still feel like something happened that initial night that initiated the whole chain of events. Is what I feel. I'm not saying that was definitely like a UFO. It could easily been they were late, they were tired, they had just left. It was like they were going to be home at 3 a.m. and they saw something that was weird, some kind of phenomenon, and it created this giant story.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like I just went, what? I haven't slept since 6 p.m. yesterday.
Oh man.
So I'm going 24 hours without sleep currently. And I know me and my wife are just on our way back from dinner. And, it's like, man, I actually like fell asleep on our way back. And I woke up, and I was in the park, I was in the driveway. And I was like, man, what are we doing here? You kind of lose, you kind of lose your memory. You kind of lose yeah. It's not hard to do when you're going, 24 hours without sleep. And, if this guy is so used to not sleeping that much, and he tries to just drive through the night.
I get that. No, I definitely get that. And that's why I think I don't know if I go all the way here. But for before people get their pitchforks out, this is Jason and I's opinions. We're not coming to conclusions. If you feel like there's more here, that there was actually an alien abduction, and you feel good about the story, I mean, that's your opinion. Jason and I sometimes come at things a little bit more objectively, I think. That's a great point, Jason. I mean, you worked last night, you work nights, you get what it feels like to be kind of sleep deprived. And that would explain that like time jump. If they're tired, dozing, whatever, the grogginess, all that stuff. They are driving through the night. They were going to get home at 3 a.m. Of course, they're going to be groggy and tired when they get home because they just drove hours and hours and hours.
Of course, the leaves on the table with the earrings. That is a little strange right there, but
That is very strange. That is very strange. But that also, if you're going to say the story kind of became a bigger thing, I mean, maybe it could be anything. Yeah.
part of me doesn't want to believe it because I just want to believe that the aliens messed with just the U.S. government and not me at home in the middle of the woods.
That you're not going to get. Yeah, you're out in the middle of the woods at home in your house, so you probably are going to get abducted and probed.
Thanks, buddy. All I can picture is that movie. What is it?
The signs?
No, it's not the Signs. It's the one where it's a whole town of people that get abducted by aliens, and they don't remember it, and they only remember it by hypnosis, and they act like it's like a real documentary. It's like they always see the owl. They wake up in the middle of the night and they see the owl at the window.
Another show that I'll have to watch that we didn't cover during this series. Okay, so we're gonna kind of get in the weeds here, but okay, so we covered a lot over these 2 episodes. I want to say I know that I probably didn't get to everything. This podcast, for us, it's incredibly enjoyable. To Jason and I, this is a hobby, and we probably will keep it that way. We don't have like a big research team or production team. It's just Jason and I, and we're really having fun. We enjoy this. And because of our schedule, sometimes that kind of gets in the way, and our shows aren't coming out as quickly as we would hope sometimes. But we are doing our best to create these and get these out and published. So that said, I mean, we appreciate all our listeners, and we ask if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends, leave a review, reach out. We'd love to hear from you. But all that said, now that we've covered this episode, the next episode is our 10th episode. So we have a little bit of a milestone, which we're excited about to hit number 10. And number 10 is going to be an unsolved mystery. So again, thank you for listening to The Anecdotalist. Please come back next time and listen to episode 10, The Next Unsolved Mystery.